yeah, I'm very blessed, man. Things have worked out very well because obviously when March hit, I lost my entire career. Like I said, I was banking on that income. Being a magician, I watched $15,000 worth of contracts dry up over a month. I still have no bookings for this year, so I've kind of just put the whole idea to rest. I'm not chasing it. I'm not trying to do Zoom shows. I kind of just went 100% onto YouTube, social media, websites, and things have turned around and done a full 180 for me because in the last I'm going to say 3 to 4 months, I've been able to generate about 5 to 10,000 a month just from YouTube, our websites, and everything that we kind of created back kind of when COVID hit, because obviously I didn't have anywhere else to turn. So,
Yeah.
and here I sit today.
Warren Buffett knows what he's talking about.
Don't you mean Warren Buffett?
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 30 of the Richuation Room. Reoccurring guest, we have Kyle, passive income investor. He's also with the passive income educator. We're going to talk about all that kind of stuff today. Kyle, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me on again, man. It's been a little while. I was glad when you reached back out because definitely a lot has changed since we chatted last time. Because when we chatted last time, it was pre-COVID, wasn't it?
It was 6 months ago. I looked that up. So I think we were just kind of in the middle of it.
Yeah. Okay. It's hard to remember. There's been so much going on lately. And are you comfortable talking? Because you said you've gotten it, right?
Yeah, I'm kind of getting over it right now.
Yeah, it feels like it's an arm's reach away right now everywhere we are. Because you're in the U.S. and Canada here. We just went on lockdown again. So it's like 28 days of curbside pickup everywhere, no in dining, no nothing. And it's starting to get a little bit frustrating because it's just like, it doesn't matter how much effort you put in over the last 6 months, all the other people kind of screwed you over anyways. And now we're back into the same spot. So you're getting one of two things going to happen, right? You're either going to get the vaccine first or you're going to get the virus first. And like I said, it seems like from what I know going on here is like an arm's reach away from people that I know that are getting it too. So it's kind of getting down to the wire here.
Yeah. Or if you're one of the lucky ones, you'll get the virus and you'll get the vaccine. That's probably the way it's going to go.
More than likely. So yeah, man, what's going on?
Not much. For those who aren't kind of familiar with you, I'm sure a lot of the people listening are, but give us a quick backstory about kind of, the steps you took to kind of get to where you are today and the things that you're doing now.
Yeah, I'll try and summarize a quick story for those that don't know me because my career relatively started as a full-time performing magician up in the Great White North here. I did a little bit of traveling in the States too back in 2019 before shit really hit the fan, which was kind of cool. But yeah, I was a full-time performing illusionist for about a decade. Restaurant, stage shows, performed for some of the largest companies in Canada, Royal Bank, a lot of fun stuff. And I not having the security of 401ks, pensions, whatever, I ended up just finding my own path to just saving money, started self-investing. And then, somewhere around the beginning of 2019, I got a lot of inspiration from YouTube, a lot of other places, watching people start up their finance channels. And I was like, you know what, maybe it'd be fun to have an event because I didn't have anyone to talk to. I mean, when I started doing this, none of my family was really into it. I didn't have any friends that wanted to talk about it. So YouTube was kind of like my event place to learn. And then, I figured, I might as well document my own financial independence, kind of retire early journey was the goal. Because I figured on my current growth rate that sometime, obviously, most of the fire journeys are sometime in their 30s is always the big promotion on YouTube, right? Everyone's like, how can you retire by your 30s? And luckily, I started when I was 23 saving. And now I'm 28 and I managed to build about $250,000 portfolio. I got a lot of growth in there, a lot of dividends. I think we all started as heavy dividend investors, but for some reason, all my dividend friends start gearing a little more toward growth. And if you're big in the YouTube world, I mean, you're probably watching people like PPC Ian that's got his Bitcoins. And it's like everyone I listen to that advocates to the dividend side seems to have their little touch of growth here and there. But I'm very blessed, man. Things have worked out very well because obviously when March hit, I lost my entire career. Like I said, I was banking on that income. Being a magician, I watched $15,000 worth of contracts dry up over a month. I still have no bookings for this year. So I've kind of just put the whole idea to rest. I'm not chasing it. I'm not trying to do Zoom shows. I kind of just went 100% onto YouTube, social media, websites. And things have turned around and done a full 180 for me because in the last, I'm going to say 3 to 4 months, I've been able to generate about 5 to 10,000 a month. Just from YouTube, our websites, and everything that we kind of created back kind of when COVID hit, because obviously I didn't have anywhere else to turn. So, And here I sit today.
That's an awesome story. I want to get into that a little bit. I feel like being a magician is probably the number one thing, when you think about careers or things that COVID will impact, being a magician is all about being in person, right? I mean, you could attempt to do it over a Zoom call, but I can only imagine, it's not nearly the same. So maybe talk a little bit about when it started to hit and you started seeing, was it kind of, you started seeing things dry up one by one, or did it just kind of happen at that first lockdown and people stopped with their
It
bookings?
happened fast, and unlike most jobs where you kind of get the security of the income, I had contracts, and the only contract that paid me out was a government contract I had, and the only reason I could presume they paid out is because they didn't want to lose the connection they had with the performers, because it was primarily they were libraries. It was kind of like middle lower income class people, because it was basically a free to the public show, because obviously this stuff is usually kind of expensive for people to go to, and they were some of my favorite jobs, because they would book me for like 8 to 10 different shows at a bunch of different libraries. The kids were amazing. Tons of families would show up. They'd be packed rooms, tons and tons of fun. That was the only contract that paid me out. Everyone else I had bookings with didn't even matter if there was deposits. They just said, nope, we're done. And I can't believe that they're going to come back anytime soon. I mean, when March was coming around, it was kind of everyone was on edge about what exactly was going to happen. But when it hit and people knew what was going on, I mean, it was basically like all the restaurants dried up, everything. And you got to remember too, like they have to rebuild their balance sheet. So even after COVID and things open up, they're not going to, the first person they're going to hire isn't going to be entertainment. And if they are, it's going to be the cheapest entertainment. So it's like,
Right.
so I mean, I've been blessed. I don't feel nearly as bad about it. I feel bad for up and coming performers, because I've been doing this for a decade. I kind of got really blessed with the whole idea of it. I've done it for so long, traveled the whole 9 yards with it. It was great, incredible. But when I look back on it, it's kind of like, I had that experience, so I don't feel like I missed anything. So
Yeah.
I'm super grateful on that end. But honestly, I'm more happy being in the situation I am now, because obviously the way, it's kind of like survival of the fittest, right? Like if you don't figure out what you're going to do, you can't just sit on your ass and collect CERB or stimulus checks. I mean, that's not how it's going to work. Eventually, you're going to lose your skills, things are going to run out, and you're going to be back to a really low base income. So yeah, I've been very fortunate. So when I look at other entertainers, I feel terrible. I know a lot of people, they're saying that the entertainment industry is probably the greatest depression amongst most industries right now, considering Vegas had a 30% unemployment rate. Nobody's working on shows. Cirque du Soleil went bankrupt. They didn't pay any of the performers that are getting sued. I mean, the list is just endless, and you feel bad because these guys spent years working their skills. Some of these guys had to be physically fit, and now they can't really practice. I'm sure they're not going to the gyms. They don't have a stage. They don't have anything, right? So even when it comes back, they're going to be a year from getting anything together. So I mean, I'm glad that I'm out of that industry now, and I'm going to tell you the smartest thing I ever did, and I try and advocate, because even on YouTube, I notice a lot of investors are like, "Oh, well, I work for YouTube, so I might as well own Google."
Mm.
The best thing I ever did was for myself was I'm like, I'm not buying any entertainment stocks, because I work in the entertainment industry. I'm not buying any of them because I always felt like I'd be overexposed. So, oh my God, what a safe haven that was for me, because I know a lot of people were into like Wynn Resorts, and I
Yeah.
looked at them pretty aggressively, and I had them on my buy list for a while. But the only thing that stopped me from buying it was to prevent myself from overexposure, which, oh my God, what a saving grace that was as well. Because I mean, my tech stocks and all that made up for it drastically. So anybody that's out there thinking, oh, because I work for them, I should own them. Like if you work for Pepsi and you're like, I want to get that Pepsi benefit of the cheaper shares and accumulate, don't do it. Because if shit really hits the fan, right, you're going to be up shit's creek.
That's an interesting thing I haven't thought about, where by working for or in a certain industry, you're already getting exposure there with just the paycheck that's coming in. It's kind of an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, man. So putting that aside, I don't know what else I can tell you about it. I wish, like I said, the funnest thing for me about that career was just rubbing shoulders with really big corporate companies, because Christmas parties were incredible. You're working for, like, I was working for big lawyer firms. I got to introduce like the CEO of the Royal Bank. A lot of cool stuff came from that job. But like I said, I don't know how many of them are going to remember me.
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, it's not a reliable income at all. So I'm actually glad the shift happened. It was probably the greatest thing that could have happened for me, because it gave me what I wanted out of life, which is, I mean, this is kind of the dream job, really, right? The idea that you can work unlocalized and have the majority of your income being passive without your time being dedicated at any hour of the day. And especially in times like this when COVID hits, you really start to appreciate the fact that I'm kind of in a similar boat to you, where I can't really go anywhere right now. I can't really be in my studio either, but I'm still able to do this with you where I am
Right.
without having the infliction of it, right? But what about yourself, career wise? Are you still holding up? I mean, are you having issues? The fact that you're kind of getting over COVID right now, and
No, luckily or unluckily, it kind of hit right as the Christmas season came around. So we've been working like normal, and then I had this time off to begin with. So the only thing it did is punish me from not being able to see my family, basically. But
yeah,
other than that, no, it's been kind of business as usual. But I think one of the things that you've talked about, which is interesting, is you had your kind of groundwork set in the stuff that you're doing now before COVID hit. Is that right? And
yeah.
so when COVID did take place, was this a reality for you where you said, I need to ramp this up because my income or my expected income's not coming back anytime soon? Or was it something that just kind of happened over time as it progressed?
Well, luckily, I've been investing long enough to have the tolerance to deal with the volatility that hit, because the thing that kind of pissed me off the most and the big slap to reality was the fact that I didn't have enough of an emergency fund, and I was kind of on edge about trying. I'm in a really good living circumstance where luckily my expenses aren't too high, because I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do with my life this year. But I was still living at home with my parents, which is a very, very fortunate situation for what hit, because I think when COVID hit in March, I had $500 left in my account because I was really relying. March, usually January and February are my slowest months because that's after Christmas season. Nobody's doing a whole lot of anything. So my business picks up on March break. School's coming back. There's a ton of stuff going on. It's really great. So when that hit, I mean, I was really relying on that income to come in to kind of sustain my investing and everything else. And when I just saw those contracts start drying up, and this was before the government announced CERB, because I started collecting the Canadian benefits. And it's been a wild turnaround story from there. But yeah, no, I didn't really know what I was going to do. I was worried that I would have had to have dipped into my investments if I wasn't living with my parents, because again, like I had 500 to my name. I'm like, I can't, unless I
Yeah.
sell my stocks. I'm like, the dividends aren't going to cover that. I've got enough dividend income. But so what I learned is make sure you have enough emergency fund for that 3 to 6 months. Because really, if I had to dip into my investments, I would have been beating myself up, because I'm like, my portfolio dropped 30%. I mean, I had about 130,000 invested, and my portfolio dropped to like 104,000.
Yeah.
Like, it was pretty drastic. But luckily, having the proper mindset and learning over the last 3-4 years of investing, or a little longer than that, it was probably like 5 to 6 there. But I just realized that like this is the greatest buying opportunity of a lifetime, right? Like, idiots are selling their portfolios right now when you should be buying. So the thing that pissed me off the most was I didn't have any money to invest, but the little money I was scraping together, the fact that the government contract paid out, the fact that I was collecting government benefits, I was putting a large chunk of that into the stock market, while I was also advocating to my parents, invest, invest, invest. My girlfriend, I forced my girlfriend to open up an investment account in March, literally mid-March, in the midst of the crash. She had a decent chunk of savings that she put into the market, and oh my God, she basically won the lottery. My parents' accounts are up like 100% this year. My accounts are up 100% this year, and all because I just did two simple things. I didn't sell, and any money I did get, I was throwing in there, living like I'm still completely broke.
Yeah.
And then we obviously saw the turnaround story, and then I really dedicated a lot of time to driving the YouTube channel because I had nothing else to do. So it was just YouTube, websites, and let me see what I can make work with social media. So from March, April, May, June, July, August, I didn't make a whole lot. Like, I was maybe bringing in 1,500, a couple thousand a month if I was lucky. I was still collecting CERB because after my write-offs, I was probably making less than 1,000 a month. It was pretty despicable. I'm not really fond of that, because obviously, like, you feel pretty degraded when you're not making enough to sustain yourself. And then all of a sudden, my YouTube started to grow. Sponsors came in, they continued to come in, and websites were doing great. And now it's to the point where I can't believe the money I'm making, putting aside, and this is 2 years of social media. So if anybody wants to get into social media, it's probably like one of the greatest opportunities of a lifetime, right? Because I'm not a big channel. I've got maybe 8,000-9,000 followers, but off those 8,000 or 9,000, again, still generating 5,000-6,000 a month off that. So it's been one hell of almost a rags to riches if I wasn't living with my parents. But yeah, you
I
want to
like
talk
it.
stocks? We
I
can
want
talk
to
stocks.
I want to talk a little bit before we get into specific stocks. I think something that I've kind of noticed is there's a lot of YouTube channels out there, a lot of people that try and do what you're doing, and or their version of it. But not all of them have the wherewithal or have the ability to kind of create that community around them. And I think something that you and obviously Matt Money, who I've had on the channel before, you guys have kind of worked together on this, is you've really built a community, which has probably helped in terms of people coming back to the channel and having those loyal followers. So when you built this community of people that are all learning from each other, all kind of looking to you and Matt to potentially kind of get some advice, and I'm sure you guys get advice from them. Is this something that you did intentionally, or is this just something that kind of happened over time? And what I'm getting at here for those that are unfamiliar is they have a few different things. They have a joint channel where they do streams every week talking about various topics. They have a WhatsApp and a Discord group, and then, of course, different courses as well, where you can kind of get more in-depth learning from them. So I don't want to steal all the thunder, but that's just kind of the background that I'm getting at here. And then going back to that first question, was this intentional, or did this just kind of happen over time?
I didn't know what the results would be initially, but I think it just comes from the fact that we want to learn. Like, I only post what I'm doing and what I know, what I find interesting. But I think if you're trying to get into this, and where you find success in any business is the two things I see most people having issues with is dishonesty. Any channel I watch where people kind of loophole the truth around the realities is going to hinder your performance on any aspect of what you're doing in life, because people see bullshit pretty quick. So I mean, like, I'll tell you my living situation, I'm open about my finances. I mean, that's where people are going to connect the most, is just being relatable. And if you're not truthful, you're not going to be relatable, which is the first biggest problem most people have. The second biggest problem is the grind. When I started this, I had conviction to basically put in a 3 to 5 year plan, because any business you ever start, you typically have a 3 to 5 year plan, because most businesses don't kick off until you get about 3 years through. Which, same thing with my magic career. I worked for Tips for 3 years doing magic. I didn't have any real paying jobs, but Tips paid okay. And that's where you're going to meet people and get your introduction. Same thing with YouTube. Like, the first year of YouTube, I didn't make a dime. Same with the first few months into the second year. It's not like I wasn't making any real money. But when you go into these ideas, you need to have the conviction to say, look, like, here's what I'm going to do for the next 3 to 5. And you're either going to stick to it and kind of document where you're going to want to be over the 3 to 5 and kind of base it off what other people have seen. And if you're not keeping up with that baseline, then obviously you're going to have to change some things. But I post a video about 6 days a week. Yeah. I've done that now for over 2 years. And it's another big fall point that most people end up running into, is they get burnout. I don't particularly get burnout until my body finally decides to reject what I'm doing and I crash. But that's just it, man. It's just being consistent, being there when people have questions, answering those questions. The community is great because obviously, like, I'm still learning. I don't know everything. I only hold 17 stocks. People throw stocks at me every day. And they're like, what do you think? What do you think? And my question is, well, what do you think? Like, why do you find it interesting? And tell me why I should be interested, because I can't tell you if it's a buy or a sell or this or that. I mean, I don't know everything, right? So it's nice to have the community that kind of joins in when you're transparent, especially with Matt too. Like, Matt's a super transparent guy, very successful, really good job. So again, like, people, I think, just appreciate the honesty of the story and where you're coming from and where you've gone. And like I said, it's just being minimalistic and, being dedicated to the idea of what you're trying to do, and don't bullshit it. So like I said, I live like I'm broke so I can one day, have the financial independence to be a little bit more fluent and lenient with my time. Because it's not about money, right? Like, I think that's another big mistake people think too, is like, everybody's grinding, they're making all this money on YouTube just because they want to get rich, but it's more about the freedom of time. I enjoy doing this. I enjoy the grind, so it doesn't wear me down as much. But at the end of the day, like, it's all about the freedom of your time. Like we were talking earlier, right? Like, the idea that you can get up, go wherever, do whatever, whenever you really want. To me, that's like the ultimate. No matter how much money you have, like, you could have a lot less money, but if you can work a career like YouTube, where you can do it from Vegas, Japan, like whatever, spend it with your family. I mean, that's the end vision for pretty much everything I'm trying to do right now. But the magic for me is fun. I really enjoyed that as a career. So I'm hoping to do a little bit of that maybe sometime when things open up again. But that's more of a hobby now than it will be, obviously, any kind of full-time business. So, but yeah, I love the community, man. I'm glad that it worked out the way it did. It's unintentional, because no one ever really knows what the results are going to be. But if you put the grind in, usually you'll find something will come around the corner, right?
Yeah, I like it. What was the thought process in the expansion? So I'm assuming you started your channel individually, and then as kind of time went on, you guys get together and create the second channel. And then how do you actually pull the trigger on saying, you know what, I think what we are providing is worth, offering potentially some money for? Specifically, you guys had the tracker and things like that I'm talking about.
Providing value is hard, and understanding how to price that value is extremely challenging. It's something we still struggle with. It's something we still experiment with. When I met Matt, it was really actually kind of hilarious because when I was first starting out on YouTube, I was watching a bunch of guys. I was watching Matt. I was watching people with relatively large portfolios, and I loved it because they were live streaming and I could comment and joke with them. And I remember one day I was joking with Matt that maybe one day we'll get to smoke a cigar together. We kind of laughed about it on his stream, whatever. And then out of nowhere, I was watching one of his streams off cuff, and he's like, "Oh, I got a turnover flight in Toronto." So I was like, "Hey, you're in Toronto." He's like, "Hey," I'm like, "I'm literally like an hour away." I'm like, "We should chill." And he's like, "Yeah, sure, man. I'll meet up with some rando from YouTube at a hotel lobby." And we ended up actually smoking some cigars, just chit chatting. And I was looking at his website and what he was doing, and he started doing the finance tracking stuff. And he wasn't good with the website side of things, whereas I understood like Shopify, I understood WordPress, those companies really, really well. So I'm like, hey, why don't we do this, this, and this? We'll partner, and we'll see where it goes. And yeah, one thing led to another, and yeah, we just expanded on the idea. I don't think people realize when you're starting courses and stuff, it's almost impossible to make money unless you can provide real value to people. And if you, like I said, that comes back to the transparency, the honesty, and what they're going to get out of it. And I think the reason that we're finding more success now when you get the snowball effect is because you have self success in the decisions you're making and people are seeing it.
Right.
So not that they're going to replicate it, but let's say like MindMed, for an example, I can't tell you how much money I've made off MindMed from other people taking my advice. Not that I ever recommend people take the advice, but like we have a guy in our chat group that made over $500,000. He tipped me like a few $1,000 just because he's like, I would have never found this if it wasn't for you. It's his largest gain ever. And then like, we just chat with people, and you kind of get, once you get that trust, and people are like, holy crap, these people are doing something for me, then you're going to get that return. And that's when you'll usually start finding value without you actually having to even charge a price per se, because people will just be like, I owe you something.
Yeah.
Like that's what makes me feel so great right now, is people just have a conviction to say, look, like, you've helped me, I owe you something. And I said, look, I did nothing. I just tell you what I do, and I'm glad that you kind of found your own way through it. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's a tough question, man, because the thing I hate too about courses is you go on Facebook or whatever, you see the ads come up for Tai Lopez or whatever,
Yeah.
and it's like, hey, this is a $1,200 course, but for you it's $30. And I'm like, wow, you're really selling a lot of value. You really believe in your product to say it's worth a few grand, but you're going to give it to me for $30. I'm like, we're not charging an arm and a leg here. But I just think it's funny because the courses, I think, are dying off. But if you can find that audience and have that conviction, I think you'll find the value at some point, and you can gauge it out.
Yeah, I think it's also different because, at least at this point, this could change, but you guys are accessible, right? It's not like you're just buying this course from this random guy that's promoting it ridiculously, and then you buy the course and it's like, okay, well, if I have questions, what do I do? Most people probably find your products because they trust you guys beforehand. It's not the other way around.
Yeah, nowadays it was a little harder in the beginning because everybody just thinks they can jump the gun, right? Like everyone's like, I want it now, so let me make a course and let me start the
Right.
YouTube. And then they're like, why am I not getting sales? And it's like, well, again, how long have you been doing it for? Well, a year. It's like, okay, well, what do you expect? How many people started $1 million business in a year? Like, yeah, they're on there, but if you keep watching those guys, 9 times out of 10, it's not you.
Right.
like I said, I'm 2 years deep, and I know channels that have exploded to 50, 100,000 subscribers, and I'm still sitting at 8 to 10,000. But I'm happy with where I'm at, because like you can't really compare yourself to other people in that aspect, or you're going to start diluting your idea of like your own growth, and you end up thinking you're not going anywhere. But again, like I'm producing a pretty substantial amount of income off a really small audience, but we are also in the highest paying niche. And I think anybody watching this is probably more geared towards stocks, but you can't say like gaming is going to be the same kind of income level as stocks,
Right.
because it's a whole different ballgame, right?
I think it's funny when you look at the income level, or the YouTube income level of some of the biggest YouTubers that are just vloggers, and they're not doing anything related to or around money, where it looks like their audience is probably going to be people that don't have a lot of expendable money. It's sometimes the difference in the amount of views they get is comparable to a smaller finance channel, just because of the niche itself.
Yeah, I don't know if you talk a lot with your audience about like AdSense, but Google does not pay a lot of money. Even in the stock niche, because you got to remember, Google takes 50% of the cut, and the stock market niche is the highest paid niche on YouTube, considering that the CPM, which is the cost per milli, which just stands, I don't know why they use these weird terms, but essentially the cost per thousand views of what YouTube will pay you in the stock market niche is usually between $20 and $30, usually mid-range 24, 25 is what I get. And when you're looking at these other YouTubers that are vloggers, usually their income level is on that cost per thousand because, again, not related to finance, where people aren't going to be paying as much for the advertisements. Because again, like if you're a video gamer and all your audience is kids, how do you advertise to those kids? What are they going to buy? It's going to be really hard to convert those. So Google pays you a lot less. Google AdSense works on a bid system and how much somebody's willing to pay for those ads. So it's like, yeah, you could have a gamer with 50,000 followers only making the same amount of money I am with 8,000 followers because they're in a lower paid niche. But the real money doesn't come from that. The real money comes from sponsors. I mean, it's crazy what people are willing to pay to get in front of certain audiences. And it goes so far beyond YouTube. YouTube pays, again, that 1,000 or $20 per 1,000 views. That 1,000 views, a sponsor might want to pay 50 cents to $1 per view. So in my niche, that would be 500 to $1,000 against what I would get paid from YouTube being $20.
Yeah.
Like that is a night and day difference. So you have to kind of, and if you're in a right niche and you're good at what you do, the sponsors will come to you naturally. That's the only thing that I found really interesting is when I started YouTube, the sponsors I was getting were trash. They were just the worst of the worst companies I didn't want to work with. But as you evolve and the channel gets bigger, you'll find that the people that approach you are a lot more professional and they start throwing a lot bigger numbers out there because they don't want to dick around, and they're just trying to get that quota filled and get in front of the right people in a professional manner. So to motivate some people, but
for sure. Do you find it? Do you find that you're kind of looking at these different potential opportunities and picking and choosing which one you think is right for you? Because again, it kind of comes back to that transparency and wanting to provide the content, while at the same time, you still,
not,
the whole goal of this is to make, or some of the goal of this is to make some money. So
it's not a perfect system because a lot of people get pissed when they see you doing sponsored videos. I noticed that I got some lashback, not enough lashback to like hinder my channel in any way, but it's a tough balance for sure. Finding a way that works, because the sponsors I take on are, again, stock related. So they're companies that are trying to promote their stocks. And what most people don't realize is every company at some point in their history promotes their stock. They take money, they advertise, they need to grow their business, they need to get out there, and they're not going to beg on the street for money. They want to get in front of investors. And the only way to do that is, to pay money and be like, look, I need to talk to the right people. I do pick them pretty selectively. I turn a lot of them down. I work with 3 agents right now, one in LA, one in Canada here, and I'm not sure where the third one's located, but they send me usually a list of companies, and I kind of just pick and choose at this point, which is also beautiful to have that opportunity, because a lot of them they send me, I'll reject, because they just don't work for me, because either the balance sheets really suck, I can't get behind the company, or I just don't understand it well enough that I would feel comfortable doing an analysis on it. Because when I do an analysis, I want to be able to be excited and promote it in a manner where I'm like, look, this is interesting. Like, you should look into this, even though I'm not buying it. Like, you might find it interesting. But if I look at something and I'm like, I want to say this company is crap, I don't want to hold back from that, because then you start getting into the dishonesty thing again, which people will eventually recognize, right? And I think that's the only way I've done okay with sponsors. People get pissed, but at the end of the day, it's like I'm not dishonest about it. So I don't think my YouTube app or subscribers still go up. I haven't really lost anything, so it's kind of nice that way.
Yeah, I'm sure it's kind of a balancing act. Let's get into some specifics. So we already touched on MindMed. I think we have to talk about this. It's obligatory having Kyle on the podcast. So I'm sure you've gotten thousands of questions, and let's just go from the beginning. If you could give a quick kind of rundown for people who aren't familiar, what is MindMed, or Mind Medicine, I think the full name is, and how did you first come across this company?
So MindMed is a psychedelic company that is trying to produce drugs that are going to help cure depression, opioid addiction, ADHD, anxiety, like a ton of ailments, some of the largest drug segments that plague society today. It's kind of crazy considering the scale and the scope of the segments they're trying to hit. Now, I discovered this company Actually, I think it was back in 2019 I heard about it. I didn't really care for it too much because I hate drug segments with a passion. The drug segment, pharmaceuticals are the worst investments you can ever make. They're the most riskiest because they're highly dependent on phase trials. Phase trials to get to market can take anywhere from 3 to several years before FDA approval, before they actually hit somebody's hand and then you're actually making revenue. So I usually avoid the pharmaceutical sector like the plague. For that reason, because it just burns capital. They dilute shareholders like there's no tomorrow. All they do is raise money and spend it. That's usually the business models. But the reason that I found it so attractive, I kind of re-looped back around to it. Sometime it was May, I think, of 2020. For a few particular reasons, Kevin O'Leary was really boasting about it, which I didn't really care as much for. But I really like the fact that it had Canopy Growth Corp's ex-CEO. I made a lot of money in Canopy Growth Corp, and I actually wanted exposure to it without the risk. So when I sold Canopy at a huge gain, I ended up buying into a company called Constellation Brands, which owns a huge stake in Canopy. But I ended up selling Constellation Brands because they fired the CEO of the company, which I thought was an icon to the MJ sector, which was Bruce Linton. He was the guy that was the hammer and the nail to the entire MJ market. And when they fired him, I thought it was the most ignorant decision they could have made, because these cannabis companies aren't making money because of the CEO. It's because of the regulatory issues and the way the government allowed the funnels and the sales to be set up. It was terrible. But I thought Bruce Linton was like an unbelievable guy. Like I just, it made me a lot of money. I loved what he was doing. I loved the scope and the scale, and then the government screwed everything up. So Constellation stepped in. They had a majority stake and they said, "We don't want you anymore. Get out. You're not making anything." And I thought that was the biggest mistake. So I said, you know what? I don't agree with this. I sold Constellation Brands, took my money, and then I followed Bruce Linton for a while. Really interesting guy. So I kept up on him because I remember watching an interview and he's like, "Oh, I'm finding a new place. It's really interesting." And I was like, "Where is he going to work?" And then eventually I found out that he was working for MindMed. And then my interest was like, okay, what the hell is going on here? Like, why is he so interested in this space? And then I went down the rabbit hole to realize that, if you understand anything about psychedelics at all, these are drugs that have been around since the 60s. They got marginalized because of obviously the drug rise of Coke, and obviously the fact that the government back then like just hated it. The war on drugs started this massive ordeal that led to basically putting these drugs that actually have wicked, insanely health benefits with drugs that don't, with cocaine, heroin, and all that stuff. And what people didn't realize, if you go to Johns Hopkins University, they're running a bunch of studies right now that are super fascinating. But when you understand these few things about these drugs, it's almost impossible to not realize what the phase trial outcomes are going to be. Because with, say, something like magic mushrooms, what people don't realize is these drugs are less toxic than over-the-counter Tylenol. It is almost impossible. It is impossible to OD on them unless you have some underlying condition. Because obviously, when your brain gets tripped out and your blood pressure goes up a bit, it could cause a heart attack if you have some underlying heart conditions. But realistically, even in large doses, it is impossible to OD on these drugs. You can't say that about Tylenol. You can't say that about almost any drug you're going to get from a pharmacist. Even caffeine you can OD on, nicotine you can OD on, but you can't OD on magic mushrooms for some reason. So then you got to look at, okay, well then what are the health benefits? After one large dose of psilocybin, which is the primary chemical in magic mushrooms, Johns Hopkins found out that over 80% of people that smoked nicotine were able to quit for more than 6 months after one dose. Wow. They're finding that people that are highly addicted to heroin can go in, have one major dose, and they no longer want to do heroin. Like, the outcomes of these drugs, like if you looked at it on paper, you said this doesn't exist. There's no drugs that exist like this. And again, when you're talking about anxiety and depression, if you go on YouTube and you look up people that are self-medicating these drugs, there's tons of documentation of people using it to treat depression and anxiety, which right now, if you look at the depression drugs that exist, are terrible. If you look at ADHD drugs, it's methadone, it's forms of methamphetamine that have wicked side effects. And everyone knows the antidepressants you take, when you come off of them, you tend to get a whiplash of depression that's twice as worse, because realistically, it covers up the problem. It doesn't treat the problem. So when I started really diving down into this, I said, this is like the most guaranteed investment if you're talking about pharmaceutical growth. And when you look at the scope, Kevin O'Leary says it best. He says, look, like there's only one of two things. This is gambling. Let's be real. These are highly risky speculative bets. I don't recommend anyone buying them unless they're willing to lose 100% of that capital, because there's only two outcomes here. The outcomes are either going to be worth tens, if not hundreds of billions, or it's going to be worth nothing because the FDA won't approve it. and the reason it's going to be worth that much is because these segments are the largest legal sold drug segments. If you can treat opioid addiction, which we saw the decriminalization of drugs in Oregon, which by the way, in California, which was hilarious because the guy that lobbied to decriminalize those drugs was microdosing or taking magic mushrooms every weekend to treat seasonal depression. These are politicians, by the way. These are lobbyists that are taking these drugs illegally. So, I mean, when you just look at the scope of people that are using these already to treat their problems, it's insane. So it is almost impossible to find a drug segment, a pharmaceutical segment where you can almost guarantee what you know the phase trial outcomes are going to be.
Yeah.
And because of the amount of self-use of these drugs that's documented and easily available on the internet, to me, it was just one of the easiest bets you could ever make. So I'm like, forget this. I'm going to buy, 8 or 10,000 shares. I'm going to put $8,000 in this and just pretend like I'm donating this money, because realistically, everyone's been touched by these problems. I've had best friends commit suicide from high school that I hung out with every day for years. I've watched friends get addicted to opioids, crazy drugs, got depression, cutting a wrist, just terrible shit nobody should ever have to go through. And it's crazy to think that, this solves that problem with a high degree of certainty. So I'm like, if I can fix that from happening to somebody else, let me help fund this. Let me give them the money out of the goodness of my heart. Let's pretend like this has nothing to do as an investment class. And if it works out, yeah, I'll get money back in the end, but let's see if it solves the problem first. So yeah, that made the investment. And I didn't think things would happen as fast as they did, because realistically, I mean, these phase trials aren't really going to start coming into play until 2023. So if you're buying this, you have to be able to ride the volatility, because nothing's going to come out for the next few years, or 2 years at least. But yeah, apparently people caught on to this the same way I did. They realized what was going on, and then we caught a unicorn. $100 million company is now worth 1.6 billion in less than a year, outperforming Crazy. Tesla. Yeah, it's pretty wild, man. So I mean, it's one of my favorite investments, but I don't recommend people buy into them. I don't think they're appropriate for most investors. They're just way too speculative, way too risky. I think everyone should have risk in their portfolio, but risk they understand. And this is just a segment that I felt like I understand very well. So I took the risk. It worked out for now.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I'd like to dive into a little bit more of what MindMed's actually doing. I know it's interesting. I know the CEO said that his light bulb moment was when he was working in Silicon Valley, I think it was, and a lot of the people that he knew were just microdosing on a daily basis. And that was kind of like and I know he had some personal issues with, I think it was depression as well. So kind of interesting that he's so close to the issue, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah, they were, he said that they were microdosing to get off cocaine in Silicon Valley, which is pretty insane to think about. That, again, this comes back to the point that how does this one drug treat so many segments? And we just really don't know the psychological effects, but we know the outcomes, and we know it's not toxic. So it's again, they're really bold statements. If you saw it on paper, you wouldn't believe it. Have you ever experimented with any of these drugs? No, you have no. So when I was a teenager, obviously, like, we've all done our stupid shit when you thought stuff was terrible. And I have some experience in understanding. I've tried a lot of dumb stuff to the point where I scared myself pretty absurdly. Again, I stopped, whereas my friends did. And this was a big problem, which is why I was so convicted to the company, because like, when you're a teenager, you're an idiot. But whereas I saw conviction in my magic career and trying to find some other sources to life, my friends didn't. They went down the drug path. It took over them. They got addicted to other chemicals. And like I said, the fact that you don't understand how to use these drugs correctly is another big mistake, because some of the time it's not about just tripping out on them. Like, people think, oh, you just got to blast your mind. It's like, no, you can take it to the point where you don't get high on it and still have a lot of the beneficial outcomes. Right. So I mean, it's definitely interesting to hear this. Anybody in the space, I had a really good interview with the CEO of Having Life, which is, I think, is the third largest psychedelic company, and he's in the same boat. He has a 13-year-old that was suicidal. One of his sons was in a major car accident with some drunk driver hit him, and he says, like, it was just terrible what these kids were going through, and they were using. He found cannabis to treat them. And he said it changed their lives because they were getting addicted to opioids and all these drugs. And it's like, if you can get addicted to at least marijuana, we know that the side effects and the health infliction isn't terrible. Right. And it treated their problems pretty well. So he switched. The CEO of Having Life used to work for, like, I can't remember if it's Procter & Gamble. He worked for some really large companies and just did this 180 shift into the psychedelic sector. But I think the stigma is starting to get lifted, which is beautiful. And I think people are going to start seeing that these are actual useful medicines, rather than, what we used to see with hippies and the Beatles days, and, people just frying themselves out. And people will see that these aren't drugs just to get for good times. They'll actually be, they'll change people's lives. And at the end of the day, that's all you can really ask for, right? So it's going to be interesting. I mean, do you watch Joe Rogan? Joe Rogan talks a lot about his experience with these drugs, which is really interesting. Like I said, the information's out there. People, I'm sure they've heard some things, their buddies talking about their experiences with these things. It's neat what it does on a psychological level about life, right? Like it's the point that it almost the craziest thing to me is, how can you give somebody that is on their deathbed these drugs and it makes them feel good? I don't want to say good, but it gets rid of the anxiety of death. That's the thing that blows my mind the most. In Canada, there's one company, a nonprofit organization that has a license from Health Canada to administer psilocybin to people near death in hospitals, whether it's stage 4 cancer patients or whatever. And the results they're finding are absurd. Absurd. They're saying it completely removes the anxiety of death, which is something that again, a whole nother sector of the market that you can't explain. Yeah. How do you explain that? How do you explain a drug that takes away the fear of death? Like, I don't know. It's like I said, it's incredible stuff. So it's going to be the forefront of medicine. And speaking of the medicine stuff, I'm also very fascinated by what ARC-G is doing. I'm sure you've heard of Kathy Wood, ARC ETFs. ARC-G is her Genomic Revolution ETF, which is highly focused in the healthcare space. And what I don't think people realize right now is there is going to be a massive shift in the next decade in how people get treated with health. And I've come to recognize that I'm not smart enough to understand what these companies are doing, but I'm smart enough to recognize the revolution that's going on. I mean, we're talking about curing cancers in the next 5 to 10 years. We're talking about curing pediatric blindness, HIV, diabetes. And it's just like, when you say this stuff, it doesn't seem possible because it hasn't been possible for so long. But technology has finally caught up to the point where it is highly, highly likely in the next 5 to 10 years that all of these things are going to start getting cured, and life expectancy is going to start rising again pretty drastically. So I'm fascinated by the space. It's highly speculative. It's highly risky. So I'm using MindMed as a pure play because it's a drug segment I understand very well. And I'm going to keep that as my long-term, like next 3 to 5 years. Let's see how these trials work out and see where it goes. And I'm using ARC-G as a growth ETF for health. Because again, CRISPR-Cas9, what they're doing is absolutely incredible with genome mapping and editing. Which I don't understand, man. I can show you the videos. You can see a little thing come in and pop open the DNA
proteins and
replace. Yeah, and I'm like, I don't get it. But like, these people are really convicted that this shit's gonna cure cancer. So I'm like, I'll leave it with you. Here's some money. Let's see what happens. Okay.
Yeah, I've been a big proponent of ARC, and I initially started my position in ARC-G probably in March or April. And I've been buying pretty consistently since then. And I have a video that kind of goes over, or I did my best to go over their abbreviated version of the white paper that they put out about their genomics bull case. And it's just crazy the stuff that they're doing. And I feel like a lot of it is happening behind the scenes, and it's not kind of out there for everybody to know yet. I mean, they've more or less cured sickle cell disease in multiple patients that have used CRISPR technology, and they've brought down the cost of DNA sequencing from like hundreds of millions of dollars being a government's health, project of the year back in, the early 2000s. And now it costs, I think, about $600 to develop somebody's full genome. So the stuff they're doing is insane. But I really like that. I can align with both of those. One thing I have a question on for MindMed, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I know one of their competitors, I think they're called Field Trip or Field Tripping, something along those lines. I know they actually have an office or two open in the United States. I think it's in the Pacific Northwest somewhere, but I think right now they do basically like guided sessions with psilocybin. So for those who are unfamiliar, you're basically going into like it's a medical office kind of, and you're going to be with somebody who's trained to kind of put you through, I guess, some type of psilocybin session. How is MindMed distributing their drugs? Is it going to be something similar, or will it be you go to the doctor and they prescribe you, X number of pills or whatever the case would be from there?
I'm hoping when they get into their 18MC trials, which is basically treating anxiety with I think it's called they got Project Lucy going on, which is basically I'm hoping is going to be microdose, because the real money I think we're talking about dollars and cents here is going to be in microdosing. It's not going to be in the field treatment, but they are going to be doing that in Oregon. They're opening up treatment centers that I'm highly confident right now aren't used with psilocybin. Like Oregon is basically taking all the MJ tax money they make from the marijuana cannabis stuff, and they're shifting it into treatment centers to try and deal with the opioid crisis that's going on, which is one of the biggest crises in the US right now. And I think over the next couple of years, they're going to end up shifting what these companies are doing into those clinics, which they're not right now. And like you're saying, they're all kind of divided. And the clinical trial setting, that's every company's approach right now. Compass Pathways is the largest psychedelic company in the UK. They're doing the same thing. But the reason I don't like that specifically, it's kind of like a one-trick pony. And when you're dealing with pharmaceuticals, you got to ask yourself about diversification, because if one of these drug segments don't work out, you're going to be screwed. And you're also talking about treatments that take 3 days. When you go in for full dose psychedelics, I think the trip lasts for 4 to 6 hours, but they want you to be in there for 2 to 3 days,
Wow.
just until it fully leaves your system. So you're talking about really intensive capital here. You're talking about you need nurses, you need therapists on site. You're talking about somebody going in for a few days, which means it's not going to be like everyone can just line up and get in here. It's going to be, dependent on time frames and how many people are available, which isn't the exact approach I want to go. Now, MindMed's doing similar stuff. They're going to try and approach that as well when you're obviously talking about treating opioid addicts, which I think will partner with the government very well. So it's kind of a win-loss with that, because I think they might even fast track it to start treating the opioid crisis, and you're going to see some partnership with the government. But where the real money is going to be when they start entering into society will hopefully be on the microdose setting, when they can actually get it into pharmacists, and instead of people prescribing ADHD pills and prescribing, depression drugs, they're going to be prescribing these medicines alternatively. That again, I'm more excited for, because they're less toxic than what these people are taking already. And I mean, I don't know how you're going to administer it to kids, because they're already giving kids Ritalin and these ADHD drugs, which is also really incredible to say, because you wouldn't give a kid a psychedelic, but at the same time, why are you giving a kid meth?
Yeah.
A chemical form of meth. I mean, it's just, and I know kids, like a lot of kids, that their parents can't handle them, and they all have them on, methadone. It's like, what? I'm like, how can you give
Yeah.
so it's gonna be neat. It's gonna be neat.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be fun to watch over the next few years, that's for sure. What do you I hate talking about specifics here, but you've talked about a ton on your channel, but do you have a sell point for this stock? If it just booms after a potential New York Stock Exchange, is there a point where you would say, it's time to take some off the table, or is this just a long play?
So the reason I haven't taken some off the table yet is for tax reasons. This year has been very flip-floppy for me, and I'm just kind of trying to mitigate my taxes so I don't get screwed royally here with taking, because the problem with taking government benefits is the government is presuming that you're not making money. And when I was taking those government benefits, I wasn't making money. But then all of a sudden, the last 3 or 4 months of the year, my income exploded, and I'm like, oh shit, if I'm not careful here, they're going to start taking that back. And if they take that back, that's going to be a huge tax burden for the income that I have. So if I sell MindMed at a capital gain, luckily Canada only charges you 50% on those capital gains, but I'm sitting up about $40,000. So even if I took half of that off the table, that's like, half a year's income in capital gains almost. So I got to be a little careful that way, but it really comes down to personal circumstance. I think like we were talking about this with the guy that made about $500,000 in our chat group, or whatever he made was a stupid amount of money. And he took some off the table just because of his risk tolerance. Because when stocks get too big in your portfolio, you got to start playing out, how you're going to handle your risk. Because if one stock becomes 50% of your portfolio, and that stock drops by 50%, now it becomes 25% of your those mood swings are way too large. So at some point you have to mitigate that risk. I'm fortunate to be in a situation where, again, I've got $250,000 portfolio. So even though I'm up, $40,000 on MindMed, it really only equates to about 15% of my overall portfolio. So I'm not up enough where I'm only 28 that I feel uncomfortable about it being 15%. And obviously it's extremely volatile. So it dropped massively. I watched it go from a 60K position to a 40K. It's all over the place, which is fine. But if it popped up to say over 100,000 or something absurd, I would likely take some off the table just to keep my risk mitigated. But in the meantime, even going into this year, I might take a little bit off just to put it into my tax advantaged accounts, maybe buy something else, because you have contribution room and I don't have the contribution limit just sitting around in cash. So I might pull a little bit off just to throw in there. But my conviction right now is it's a rarity to find stocks like this. Like Warren Buffett says, he's like, when you find something you truly understand and you're convicted to understand the outcomes and like you believe in the company, you don't want to sell it. You kind of want to own more of it. And that's kind of how I feel about it right now. I'm kind of in the point where I'm having a real hard time looking at that sell button, because I'm like, the longer I hold on to this, the higher the likelihood's going to be that there's going to be a much greater outcome than even what we're seeing right now. My price target on these companies, market cap wise, I think these companies should easily be worth somewhere between 10 and 15 billion on a low end. On a high end, they should easily be 40 or 50 billion dollar drug segments. So I mean, when you look at those numbers, I made my first MindMed video ever. I said, if you put $1,000 in MindMed, if it became a 40 or 50 billion dollar company, you could make a $300,000 return. The question is who has the balls to hold on to that volatility? That's the question. So I'm trying to keep that conviction for as long as I can, because like I said, I don't want to bullshit people and be like, oh, it ran up, I pumped and dumped it, let's get out. Like, I don't have that conviction to the company. So patience. I'm going to try and be patient with this one and leave it there for a little while. But at some point, you got to take capital gains, man. These are companies that don't pay dividends, so you don't want to hold them until you die.